Arthur Griffith, who had both died the previous year during the Irish Civil War. Although the life and legacy of Michael Collins has been much celebrated and debated, Arthur Griffith does not feature as prominently in our remembrance, but he was without a doubt a major figure in Irish nationalism. So what of his life and legacy? Well, to talk about this, back from his Holliers, I'm joined by Dermot Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD. Dermot, good morning.
Good morning, Pat.
Tanned and bronzed you're looking.
I didn't get that in Ireland.
No. Now, first of all, tell us about Arthur Griffith. We'll come to his early demise, and when I said he died during the Civil War, not in action.
Not in action.
So we'll come to that in a while. A Dubliner.
A Dubliner. Born in Dublin City in 1871, and he would have been educated in the inner city by the Christian Brothers, but formal education would have ended before the age of 13, and he was apprenticed into the printing trade. His father had been a printer, so that was very much in his bones and was a very, very important part of his career because he became such a renowned journalist. But what's interesting about his early life, he is a voracious reader. He's largely self-taught. Formal schooling ends at an early stage. He spends an awful lot of time in the National Library. He's reading everything he can get his hands on. And again, that shines through.
I'm just thinking of young fellas today.
Yeah.
How many young fellas today would be in the National Library boning up on anything?
Well, this is the thing. You will mostly find, I suppose, people who are studying for a specific project, or, postgraduate students, or you often find retired people in there, or researching family history, that kind of thing. But this was what he did with his spare time. So he wasn't a lad about town by any means.
Yeah.
He had a very different kind of temperament to many of his peers and his contemporaries. And he took his reading and his learning very, very seriously.
Now, his father, you mentioned, was a printer. His father was one of those who printed The Nation.
That's right. There was a very strong tradition of sons following their fathers into the printing trade. And you've got to remember, in the context of his father, how literacy had expanded, how the newspaper industry was expanding in the 19th century, and his father would have been a part of that. And
you have to think of the Christian Brothers. Edmund Ignatius Rice, I think the school I was in, O'Connell School, was founded in 1829.
Yeah, they were going right back. Yeah, the 1820s is a crucial decade for the Christian Brothers, and they begin to spread. And of course, they place a huge emphasis on the importance of reading and writing. But in relation to public readership, in relation to public audiences for newspapers, that's vastly expanding throughout the 19th century. And he does go into the printing trade. But ultimately, Arthur Griffith is more interested in writing and editing newspapers than he is in printing them. But he can actually do both at the same time. So he does pick up very valuable skills there. So that influence of his father was significant.
Now, what about his politics? When did he become politicised?
Well, he was 20 when Parnell died. And one of his abiding memories of that period of his life was the funeral of Parnell, which was such a momentous occasion. Died tragically and prematurely at the age of 45. And he remembered that, and he was a Parnellite. There's no doubt about that. But what he begins to engage with from then on, the 1890s in particular, are all of these new radical societies. There's a very strong tradition within the printing trade of young apprentices getting caught up in radical politics. There's a whole host of societies, and there's language organisations, obviously the Gaelic League. He was interested in that. And he's drawn towards some of the radical strands, and he's drawn towards the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now, he's never really a fully committed Republican or member of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He leaves it at a fairly early stage. But he is drawn towards all these radical groupings.
Now, he took himself off to South Africa. Now, how many people today with aircraft and so on have been to South Africa? Not so many.
No.
But this is a fella in the 1890s.
There's a mixture of reasons for that. It's partly for health reasons. There were a lot of people who were seeking more temperate climates due to health reasons. And he could be quite frail at times, even though he was a remarkably resilient man.
But did he have TB?
I'm not sure if he had TB, but he had a fairly weak disposition.
TB would have been everywhere anyway.
Yeah. I don't know if he had TB, but it's partly for health reasons, but it's also for political reasons. What's going on in South Africa at that time? You've got the Boer War, and he's hugely sympathetic to the Boers, but he's also interested in the whole question of colonisation and how that is working in resistance to colonisation. But he also begins a newspaper in South Africa, which is not particularly successful. And then he goes on to work in a gold camp. He's a supervisor in a gold camp, and he picks up interesting experiences there. But the question, I suppose, is, has he a long-term future in South Africa? He doesn't. And what is happening back in Ireland in 1897, 1898, a character called William Rooney is starting a new newspaper called the United Irishman. And he decides that Arthur Griffith would be the right person to edit that. So he lures him back, because William Rooney was supposed to edit the paper himself, but he lures Griffith back to edit that, and that begins a new phase
Yeah. Now, that was in the 1899.
Yeah.
And then Rooney himself died in 1901. So
he died very prematurely, and Griffith was devastated by his death. But he's well able to fill the void. And that's the thing. He comes into his own then. He has his own newspaper. He fills an awful lot of it himself.
Yeah.
But he also invites contributions from all sorts of writers, including James Joyce, who defended, the amount that he wrote and the amount of articles that he had to call in as favours on the grounds that he couldn't fill the entire thing himself. But this is where we get the range of Griffith. He's a very lucid writer. His range is extraordinary. I mean, it's estimated that in one of the editions he wrote in a single edition about 9 different countries and the experiences of these countries. He's particularly interested in the experience of small nations, as an example for Ireland. He's also very vicious, in often quite an amusing way. He can be very intemperate, very polemical. It's very much a style of that propagandist journalism at that time. A lot of the publications of that era are very short-lived. The United Irishman does pretty well, but eventually Sinn Féin is the other newspaper he moves on to, which at one stage in 1909, 1910, he's producing it every day.
Every day, a daily newspaper.
Yeah. Now, he can't sustain that, but he does do it for a year.
Was he the person who coined Sinn Féin?
Yes, I mean, Sinn Féin, you will find Sinn Féin being used at an earlier stage in the 1890s. But what he tries to do is make it more of an intellectual force, not a political party at this stage, but a Sinn Féin idea. Okay, if Sinn Féin has been mentioned by people other than Arthur Griffith at an earlier stage, he's not the very first person to use it, but he coins it in the sense that it has to mean something. So what practical meaning can you give it? What could Sinn Féin mean, in other words, in practice ourselves alone? Could it mean economic independence? Could it mean the establishment of an Irish Parliament and abstention from Westminster? And these become cornerstone policies of Griffith. But he's not particularly interested in leading a political party.
Now, Sinn Féin, if that's to be credited to Griffith, Cumann and Gael also.
Yeah, you see, this is where you get this.
So I'm just thinking of next year and the rows over who's what.
Yeah.
I mean, if you say Arthur Griffith is Sinn Féin as, if you like, an intellectual force, and Cumann and Gael is Fine Gael, I mean, does Enda have the more serious claim than Dev, for example, or Jerry Adams to the term Sinn Féin?
Well, what anti-treaty Sinn Féin had to do in 1922 and 1923 was scramble around for a new name to distinguish themselves from the anti-treaty Republicans, pro-treaty Sinn Féin. And they went back, of course, to names that had been used by other smaller groups. And these are very small groups. I mean, what Sinn Féin arises out of is an amalgamation of different smaller groups, including Cumann and Gael and the National Council. So there are a number of different groups there. But Sinn Féin is not a nationwide movement or anything like it in that first decade of the 20th century. It cannot in any way compete with the dominant Irish Parliamentary Party. So it's still very much a minority cause. And it's not taken that seriously by many people. And even if you go up to the 1916 Rising, when it was often referred to by the British authorities as the Sinn Féin Rebellion, it wasn't the Sinn Féin Rebellion. There were those who were sympathetic to Sinn Féin active in it, but it was an IRB, a Fenian rebellion. But in a way, ultimately, Arthur Griffith and Sinn Féin benefited from that kind of brand recognition.
Yeah. Now, he got married to his fiancée of some 15 years.
Yeah, he was very slow. He was very slow to get married. Very preoccupied, obviously. But there was extraordinary devotion between them.
Maud Sheehan.
Maud. And they had 2 children, Nevin and Ita. They were very happily married. Now, he'd no interest in money. Absolutely none whatsoever. And what happened when they got married after 15 years courting was that a group of his friends came together and bought him a house. And that was crucial because it gave him a degree of stability. But, he's not remotely materialistic. And that's very, very, very difficult for Maud. And she's left in dire circumstances after he dies.
Now, his political beliefs, for example, he was one of those who organised a protest or helped organise a protest against the arrival of the new monarch after Queen Victoria died. But he also had monarchist ideas, didn't he, that we could have a loyalty to the monarch, who would be monarch of 2 independent islands.
He's a dual monarchist, what they call a dual monarchist. I mean, he's profoundly Anglophobic, but he's also quite practical. And what he did was he looked at the example of Austria and Hungary. Hungary being defeated by the Habsburgs, and then they come to an agreement with Austria in 1867 that they will have equal status, that they will have a shared recognition. And that's essentially what he was advocating for Ireland, the resurrection of Hungary.
Easy in the sense that the monarch had no political power.
Yeah.
So you have all the political power for yourself, but you doff the cap to the monarch.
Well, the idea was that, you would have a common allegiance. And if you're going to persuade unionists, for example, that they need to buy into the idea of a 32-county Ireland, there has to be a bone for them there. So that's partly the reasoning. But it's also because he was not a Republican,